Good afternoon. Thank you. Now for something completely different. I was having a conversation this morning with somebody, and I mentioned that last week I spent, last 2 weeks actually, with executive teams at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I'm from Pennsylvania. And what we do is we use the history of the battle to talk about leadership. And I often get this reaction like, yeah, what does running a battle in 1863 have to do with running a modern organization? Or for that matter, what does military leadership have to do with running modern organizations? If you think about this for a moment, especially if you don't have military experience, in its ultimate test of combat, the military actually functions in a highly decentralized way. If you think about what decision makers are asked to do, you often have young people confronting situations for the very first time, making high-stakes decisions on tight timelines with imperfect information. So does that sound like anything you've seen in your business experience? Okay, so in fact what I do is I use use history to identify principles of leadership that we can then use to spark conversations about how we want to lead our own organizations. And that's what I propose to do with you here this afternoon, is to share with you some insights into leadership that come out of my research as a military historian, and then invite you to connect the dots to what that looks like in a modern organization today. So I'm going to share with you some stuff that comes out of this book, Combat Jump, about the airborne invasion of Sicily in 1943, and I need to introduce you to two characters in order to do that. The first one, and this is I'll spend a lot of time talking about Colonel Jim Gavin, pictured here in 1944, who was the commander of this American assault, and I'll come back to him. And the second person I want to introduce you to is then Captain, now Colonel retired Edwin Sayer from Breckenridge, Texas, who is pictured here on the right. This picture was taken in the late summer of 1943, and Colonel Sayer has joined us today. He is sitting down in the front row here. Okay. And I also want to thank our the sponsors who very generously provided the opportunity for Colonel Sayer to join us today. But we're going to start with Colonel Sayer's then boss, Jim Gavin, who in 1942 is a 35-year-old colonel in the U.S. Army. And the Army says, look, we want you to go down to Fort Benning, Georgia, and we want you to build from the ground up a brand new organization that uses a brand new kind of technology, essentially, to deliver soldiers to the battlefield. These are going to be paratroopers. And then a year from now, just to see how well you've done, we're going to send you into combat against the most successful military organization in the world, which at the time, I would argue, was the German Army. So this is a pretty tall order for this 35-year-old colonel to get. And as with any organization, if you are, if you're thinking about what you're going to, you got to think about your resources that you have to deal with. So he thinks about the resources available to him even as late as 1942. The Army that he grew up in is in no way ready for this challenge. Gavin is commissioned out of West Point in 1929. The military and the Army go hungry with everybody else during the Depression. So as the war breaks out in Europe in 1939 and even as late as 1942, there aren't the resources at hand. There are not enough machine guns. There are not enough blankets. There are not enough jeeps. There are not enough socks. There is not a deep pool of people, experienced people, from which he can draw to build this team. So he's got a pretty significant challenge here. So as he thinks about how he's going to do this, he's got to think about the environment in which he's going to operate. And if you're planning a new business venture, well, what's the environment in which we're going to operate? So the overwhelming characteristic of combat is chaos. Everything's going to go wrong. The enemy gets a vote. Unexpected stuff happens all the time. So as he thinks about the organization that he needs to build, it's got to be able to function and succeed in a chaotic environment. So he needs leaders at every level of this organization who are willing to step up and make a decision. He needs individual soldiers who have bought into the mission to the extent that when the whole plan falls apart, somebody's still going to step up to get the job done. So this is the environment in which he's going to have to operate. But as he thinks about his challenges, one of the challenges is that most of the young men that he's going to lead into combat, when the war breaks out in Europe in 1939, these guys are in junior high school. So the only way to get them ready and get them performing at a level that's going to allow them to succeed is to inspire them so that they can do more than they thought they were capable of doing. We're talking about citizen soldiers who have to step up here. Inspirational leadership is what we're talking about. There are essentially three kinds of leadership. Lots of ways to slice this, but a handy way to think about it. There is leadership from authority, do this or else, I'll make your life miserable. And that works for about the first 3 days of basic training, and then that goes away. And then you have, I call exchange leadership. It is, if you do this thing, I'll give you this reward. It's a basic sales organizations. My wife is a psychologist. She calls that press the bar, get a pellet leadership. And then you have inspirational leadership. Inspirational leadership, Dwight Eisenhower said, was when other people are doing what you want them to do because they want to do it. They are personally and emotionally invested in the mission. Each individual is. That's a pretty high bar. That's what Gavin is going to have to shoot for this team. He's got to figure out an organization that can recover very quickly from shock and function amid chaos. An organization that is flexible, that can spot opportunities early, bring the right resources to bear, and still be ready to turn on a dime when the situation calls for it. So he has the whole drive from West Point, New York to Fort Benning to think about this and come up with the answers. So, I mean, how hard could it be, right? So the ultimate challenge is not building a cool-looking organization. The ultimate challenge is building that organization and then having it succeed, in this case, in combat. So because we have the benefit of hindsight, what I'm going to do is jump ahead in the story from the summer of 42 to the summer of 43. I'm going to give you a little snapshot of just how chaotic this environment is. Then we'll go back and we'll figure out how Gavin prepared to succeed in that environment, okay? So it is now July 9th, 1943. Jim Gavin's a 36-year-old full colonel now. He is struggling to keep his footing as his aircraft is getting knocked around by 35-knot crosswinds on a 3-hour flight from Tunisia in northern Africa to the island of Sicily. They are about to spearhead the Allied invasion of Sicily. Jim Gavin has been a professional soldier his entire adult life. He enlisted in the Army at 17 years old, but he's never been in combat before. Nor have any of the other 3,400 men in 225 aircraft up in the air that night. None of them has ever been in combat before either. So he's got some pretty predictable concerns, right? Who's going to perform well? Who's going to perform poorly? Did we prepare for every contingency? Did we bring the right equipment? Have I accurately estimated what the enemy is going to do? And then he's got this additional burden because Gavin is about to attempt what no American commander has ever done before in history, and that is to lead a large body of men into battle by parachute assault. Never been tried by the Americans before. And here's why they decided to use paratroopers. This is the southwest coast of Sicily. Two of the American invasion beaches are near Gela and Scaliti. What has happened is the Germans and Italians defending the island, principally we're worried about the Germans because they're better equipped and better trained, they have pulled back 12 or 15 miles from the coastline to get out of range of the guns of the U.S. Navy out there. And what they're going to do is they're going to wait to see where the Allies commit. And when they figure that that's the invasion beach, they're going to counterattack on the morning of D-Day. The invasion is most vulnerable at the water's edge. If you've ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, you can envision what that is. That's where the invasion is most likely to fail. The paratroopers then are going to jump into that space between the invasion beaches and the enemy and seize the bridges and causeways and road intersections to block those counterattacks coming out of the hills on the morning of D-Day. If they fail, the invasion is in jeopardy. And if they fail, they're all now on an enemy-held island if the invasion doesn't work, because it's just, you get the parachute, you get a one-way ticket with that thing. There's no going back here. So Gavin has all of this going on in his head, and as if all of this is not enough to give him a stress-induced heart attack, about 11:30, 23:30, he starts to get the sinking sensation that we might be lost. Because he looks out the jump door. There's a big open hatch on the left side in the rear of the aircraft. And I actually interviewed, of the 150 some odd paratroopers I got to know over several years, I interviewed some of the guys who were sitting right at the end of that, at the back of that aircraft, Gavin. He looks out the door and he can see a fleet steaming toward the beaches. Now some of the other guys, they thought, all right, that's good, the rest of the team is showing up. Okay, we're not going in alone. But Gavin knows, yeah, we're not supposed to see this fleet. There are 2 American invasion fleets, right, 2 beaches, on parallel courses separated by about 15 miles. The Air Armada is supposed to be in between them. So as he looks down and sees one, he thinks, yeah, it's probably not the Navy that's lost here. It's my 26-year-old pilot who's been struggling for 3 hours against this strong crosswind. So he waddles over to the right side of the aircraft. Now you have to picture this. I say waddles because when you get strapped into a parachute harness, you have these big web straps behind your knees that yank them, feels like up to your ears. You've got about a 25-pound main parachute, about another 18 pounds reserve parachute, about 9 pounds with your weapon and ammunition, strap on some hand grenades and an entrenching tool and a bayonet and a fighting knife and a steel pot and a first aid pouch and a map kit and a little haversack with a couple pairs of socks and maybe your toothbrush, little food in there. You're seriously weighed down. So if you move at all, you waddle. So he waddles over to the right side of the aircraft. There are windows, and he's looking out the window. And what he's looking for is for Sicily to appear, right? There's about a half moon that night. And it finally does pop up on the wrong side of the airplane. Yeah, well, like, how does that happen? I mean, imagine you're on a flight from, you know, Miami to New York, and the pilot gets on the horn, and they all have those super cool pilot voices. Those of you on the left side of the aircraft will be able to see the bright lights of Atlantic City. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, it's on the right. I mean, you know, what did you get the coast wrong? Could we? So Gavin is thinking about, like, is this Africa? Is this the mainland of Italy? Could we somehow have come around the island? So he goes back to the jump door and he leans out into that 100-mile-an-hour slipstream, and he can see down below and up ahead he can see anti-aircraft fire. So he thinks to himself, well, I don't know where we are, but we made it to the war. Okay, so we got that going for us. We didn't miss the war. When the green light above the door comes on, boom, out he goes, followed by the 18 troopers on his plane, followed by the 3,400 men on all those other aircraft. He lands hard, shucks his parachute, picks up his weapon, looks around, and immediately recognizes, yeah, this ain't where we're supposed to be. What has happened because of those strong crosswinds the pilots had been fighting? There's no electronic navigation. It's all compass, chronograph, and map. So they've been blown off course. They're flying blacked out, no lights, so the pilots are worried about mid-air collisions, so they let the formation start to drift apart a little bit. When they cross the coastline, people start shooting at them. Some of them climb suddenly, some of them hit the deck, some of them speed up. So instead of dropping the paratroopers in a nice tight drop zone, they wind up scattered over 1,000 square miles of the southern coast of Sicily. Some of them land 64 miles from where they're supposed to be, down near Syracuse. They are lost, they can't find their buddies, they can't find their equipment, they don't know where their leaders are, and as one of the paratroopers said to me, young German men with whom I had no personal quarrel were shooting at me. Okay? It's just a bad night, no matter how you cut it, right? Jim Gavin spends 2 hours thrashing around in the dark and winds up in command of exactly 5 of his 3,400 men. This is what you call your basic leadership challenge here, right? Okay, now, so what do you do now, young colonel? So, in fact, this is the moment when he comes to this realization, that and when he looks out the door. These are the 2 moments that made me want to write this book. But rather than ask what you would do now, let me ask this. Let's back up. And he gets paid to think. He's a professional. He's anticipated things going wrong. If we back up to the summer of 1942, if you're Jim Gavin and you know it's going to be that bad, what kind of people do you want on your team? What are the characteristics you want in these men, and they're all men in 1943, what are the characteristics you want in the men you're going to take to Sicily, if you know that's how bad it's going to be? Self-starters, yeah, you can't wait around to be told what to do. Creative, smart. What? Courageous, I thought you said crazy. Crazy might be. Crazy might be part of it, yeah. Agile, physically fit, technically competent. They know how to do their stuff. So if you think about, in our role as leaders, one of our first challenges is to get the right people on the team, right? So we go back to the summer of '42, and how do you recruit paratroopers? You must volunteer to be a paratrooper. Still true today, true then. You could be drafted back then, but you must volunteer to be a paratrooper. One of the techniques that they used was to send recruiters around to the various training posts and National Guard units, and their pitch was essentially, we're looking for young men willing to jump out of perfectly good airplanes at night behind enemy lines. And if your parachute opens, And if you don't break your leg or your neck or your back because you land on a wall or a road or a building, and if you can get out of your harness before it drags you across the ground because it stays inflated, and if you then get your weapon out before somebody shoots you, and you can then locate your leaders and your buddies and find your equipment out there in the dark and figure out where the heck you are in Europe, all you got to do then is survive the rest of the war. Well, the kind of young man who says, you know what, that's exactly what I've been looking for. That's the guy, right? That's who you want. Now, you're going to get some diamonds in the rough in this crowd, right? There are going to be some people, a few standard deviations from the mean. That's okay. We'll work with that. You've seen all that before. So you got to get the right people on the team. Now, Gavin's job is to develop this team, to mold this team into an organization that can function in that chaotic setting. So as he envisions the organization he needs, if you would fight hard, you must train hard. That's a truism. If you would fight hard, you must train hard. Gavin's first responsibility is to recreate as closely as possible combat conditions that will test these men, and more importantly, let them prove to themselves that they can do all these difficult things. Being an infantry soldier is a very physical job. It's a young man's game. So that means lots of long road marches, carrying all of your gear. So let's go put in 25 miles before breakfast, carrying 60 pounds of stuff. And let's go out on the rifle range for a couple days and hand-to-hand combat and bayonet and toss some grenades around. And then one of Gavin's favorite techniques was to do force-on-force maneuvers in the swamps along the Chattahoochee River down near Fort Benning. And he would wear them out, good 24, 30 hours of continuous operations, and then let them rest a little bit. He said 90 minutes was about good, until you just start to get a little disoriented because you're exhausted, and wake them up, boom, issue another set of orders, plan the mission, move out smartly, because that's what combat is going to look like. He continually tested them, challenged them, let them see that they could step up to this and creating those combat conditions. Setting expectations. They know what it's going to feel like. Now, of course, Gavin's not doing this all by himself, right? He's got an entire chain of command. One of those soldiers is a 23-year-old from Long Island named Timothy Dias, who actually was in then Captain Sayer's company. Tim Dias was a high school track star, actually won a scholarship to a Midwestern university, turns it down because he's the only source of support for his mother, a widow, and he stays in New York, joins the National Guard to earn a few extra bucks. Pearl Harbor comes along, congratulations, you're now in federal service. Tim said he volunteered for the paratroopers because if you're going to go to combat, you want the guy next to you to be really well trained, which there's impeccable logic to there, right? Because he's been in the National Guard, he has some experience, they make him a sergeant. He's a staff sergeant in this picture. But he's a little concerned because he's one of the youngest guys in the company. He thinks, well, the other guys aren't going to take me seriously. So he starts smoking a pipe, and you can just see the pipe in this. It's not persuading me any. So he's got this little boyish face. Tim is a frontline leader. He's a sergeant. He is the frontline leader. One of his responsibilities then is to teach these new soldiers all those esoteric tasks that you don't learn in shop class in high school. How do you assemble and disassemble a machine gun in the dark? How do you put a crew-served weapon like a mortar into play? How do you cross a river at night under fire? How do you conduct a reconnaissance patrol? All of these sorts of things, Tim's job is to train them to standard and hold them accountable. And the entire chain of command has to reinforce that. It's a set of things you have to learn how to do, and you have to do them to standard. There are payoffs for training. And we all know training is one of the first things that suffers, and your training budget gets cut. So what are the payoffs if we want to make a persuasive case for investing in training and developing people? Well, who wants to follow a leader who's untrained, right? When you train me, you're telling me you want me to succeed, you're investing in the team, you want the team to succeed. Tim said it was very interesting. He actually became a superintendent of schools later, that's where he retired from. He said it was interesting to watch how it changed people. First, you get technical competence. I learned how to do this new task. Then you get confidence. I'm good, you're good, you're good, you're good. We're going to be okay. It's a mental shift that goes on as a result of being trained. He said, but then there's another payoff as well, and that is you can, if you're paying attention as a leader, build an esprit on this team. Help the team nourish these bonds that are going to be so important for these guys when they get to combat. This is not an accidental byproduct of training. This is something that the leaders, Gavin and the other leaders, deliberately pursued, deliberately built into their training. There's no team like the team you've been miserable with, right? This is part of military training. When you finish a 25-mile road march and you lay out your gear and everybody carried all that heavy stuff and you did it 2 minutes faster than the guys did it yesterday, and the colonel is there to say, good job, that was great, you improved, so, you feel good about that, and you start to build these bonds. This is certainly true in business as well. I had the opportunity to work with some airline crews, ground crews, out in Denver one winter. I was watching the de-icing operations, and they're up on these cherry pickers with those steam hoses de-icing the planes, and I'm not talking about those sissy cherry pickers with the domes on the top. I'm like right out there in the wind and everything off the front range. You think those people woof big stories about how cold it was when they go back to the break room? How cold was it when you were out there? That ain't nothing. My grandmother could do that in her nightgown. That's nothing. And they build these bonds, and a good leader pays attention to that and nourishes that. My wife, early in her career, used to do bank transformations, where going from one software platform to another, she said it was this huge buildup of work, and then over one nail-biting weekend, you switch everything over, and then you hang around for a few days pulling your hair out to make sure it goes okay. She said if the team comes together, the experience is completely different. Whether or not the team comes together is a function of leadership. In her case, it paid off for the client. In Tim's case, it's going to pay off for the soldiers who are going to go with him into combat. So Tim, as that frontline leader, has to have those conversations with people. I once heard General Schwarzkopf talk about kinds of leaders. He said in 35 years in the Army, he'd only seen two kinds of lieutenants. Lieutenant is the junior-most officer. One lieutenant stands in front of a platoon of 40 soldiers and sees an entity, a unit, a tool. I will train it. We will succeed in this set of circumstances. Another kind of lieutenant stands in front of a platoon of 40 soldiers and sees 40 individuals, and I first have to mold them into a team. But they came here for different reasons. They enlisted for, one's a lifer, one can't wait to get out. This one's married, a little bit older, this one's very young. This one's very athletic, this one is not. And some have not succeeded very much at anything. I got to figure out and tap into all of those different people and figure out what's going to make them come together. So Tim, as that frontline leader, has to have those conversations with people. I once heard General Schwarzkopf talk about kinds of leaders. He said in 35 years in the Army, he'd only seen two kinds of lieutenants. Lieutenant is the junior-most officer. One lieutenant stands in front of a platoon of 40 soldiers and sees an entity, a unit, a tool. I will train it. We will succeed in this set of circumstances. Another kind of lieutenant stands in front of a platoon of 40 soldiers and sees 40 individuals, and I first have to mold them into a team. But they came here for different reasons. They enlisted for, one's a lifer, one can't wait to get out. This one's married, a little bit older, this one's very young. This one's very athletic, this one is not. And some have not succeeded very much at anything. I got to figure out and tap into all of those different people and figure out what's going to make them come together. That's Tim Dias's responsibility as that frontline leader, to have those conversations with people. Gavin is keen on setting expectations for leaders. And actually, I think it was you, sir, Colonel Sayre, who told me that Gavin had this peculiar way, or he had a unique way of welcoming junior officers into the unit. Now, he was, Gavin was a tall, slender guy, very soft-spoken, didn't raise his voice, didn't swear. And when a new lieutenant would come in, he'd say, so you're a lieutenant, huh? I'll tell you what, around here, that means last one in the chow line, first one out the aircraft door. Last one in the chow line. When it comes to the perks, when it comes to the good stuff, when it comes to the benefits, you put yourself last as a leader. And you can go to the field with any Army or Marine unit today, and you'll see they set up the chow line. It's big cans of stuff, and you go down the line, and they serve it out to you, and they frequently run out of food. Gavin's point is it should not be that 19-year-old private who has no control over where he stands in line who goes without eating. And when that private looks at the end of the line and sees the lieutenant eating toast for the third day in a row, he goes, you know what, that's an okay lieutenant down there. And you start to build those bonds. That lieutenant's going to take care of me. First one out the aircraft door, literally, in World War II, the ranking person was the guy standing in the doorway of the aircraft. But this is not just advice for day-to-day living. This is an entire leadership philosophy. When the situation calls for somebody to be out front, to be identifiable, to be a leader, to make a decision, that's where the leader needs to be. Visible, in charge. Last one in the chow line, first one out the aircraft door. Gavin knows that, or his thinking was that if you win at the lowest levels, if your unit succeeds, if your organization succeeds in the front line, you can succeed. If you don't succeed out there, everything else is for naught. So in training exercises, they push decision-making down to those junior leaders. In every map table discussion, in every field exercise, at some point it always became about, okay, you know, the captain did it, the lieutenant did it, sergeant, what are you going to do? What if you can't find the lieutenant when you land? How are you going to get the job done? What are you going to do about it? That question encapsulates leader development right there. Think about the message you get when somebody asks you that. This person thinks I can do this, or expects me to do it. I'm supposed to step up and contribute something here. In my case, one time I was asked that question, and I realized I should pay more attention when they brief the mission here, so I have a deep understanding of what's going on. But you get all of those messages, and it encourages those people. They have an expectation I'm supposed to step up and do something. And he pushed decision-making down that way so they could practice things. So by the spring of 1943, they're doing the right things, Gavin's vision of how they're supposed to operate. They're doing things the right way, because Sergeant Dias, Captain Sayer are training them to do it that way and holding them to standards. And they're doing things because they want to. Gavin and his leaders had created a unit that was so cool, the guys are willing to work extra hard to be part of it. Their attitude is not, I'm a paratrooper, I got to do all this extra stuff. Their attitude is, if I do all this extra stuff, I get to be part of this team. That's a significant mental shift that goes on there. In April 1943, they set sail from New York City, bound for the European theater. They land in Casablanca in Morocco, in North Africa. Debark, go to a place called Oujda, northern edge of the Sahara Desert, absolutely miserable conditions. Easily 120 degrees during the daytime. One of the physicians said he once was curious about how hot the sand was, and he stuck a thermometer in sand, and it burst on him. That's hot. Hot wind blowing off the desert continuously, carries with it this fine sand like talcum powder that gets in everything, gets in your person, gets in your equipment, gets in your food. You're issued 2 quarts of heavily chlorinated water per day. 2 quarts of water a day in that temperature, you're not doing a lot of bathing. People predictably then get very sick. Young men who had been in the peak of health when they left the States are now getting ill. Gavin continues to push them hard, to train hard. Why? Because he knows the date for combat is fixed. D-Day in Sicily is July 10th. Soldiers don't know that yet, but he does. If I slacken up, I'm not helping anybody out. More interesting to me is they continue to work hard. Why? Because they trust him. The old man would not ask us to do this if it wasn't important. And oh, by the way, he's out here with us. Gavin is sharing those hardships. This kind of stuff does not work if you're emailing instructions from an air-conditioned trailer someplace, all right? He's right out there, sleeping on the ground, sweating bullets just with everybody else. Gavin continues to train them hard. He is also keen on how he communicates. He communicates constantly. They get the same message repeated in different ways, and he uses every available channel, multiple channels of communication. For instance, in training, they build out in the desert full-scale mock-ups of the invasion area. They build road intersections and put in minefields and wire and trenches, and they practice the assault, and they practice until every man knows in muscle memory, yeah, this is what's going to be expected of me. Gavin's favorite method for talking to the troops was to do just that, stand on the hood of a Jeep, and just have the guys gather around. I said he was sort of a soft-spoken guy, but he liked that personal connection. He cannot do that on the eve of the invasion because they're taken off from 12 different departure airfields. So instead, he arranges to have a message, a note, a piece of paper, 1 copy delivered to each man. And if you look in the center of your table, there's some papers there that have a copy. Pass those out if you would. Gavin's letter is reproduced there, and I'd like everybody to get a copy. And just take a moment to read that. So I first saw an excerpt from this in Gavin's memoirs, but I never actually saw one of the sheets of paper until I interviewed a former paratrooper by the name of Richard Knopf, who lives in Pennsylvania, not too far from where I live. And we arranged to meet at a diner. And Richard was a 22-year-old private that night. He said he'd lost about 15 pounds in the desert, so he wasn't doing real well. He's a demolition man. He gets to carry, in addition to all that other stuff, he gets to carry a bunch of plastic explosives. He's so loaded down that he cannot move. He said, I was lying on the ground under the wing of the airplane like a turtle on my back. Somebody has to come along and pick him up and then shove him up into the airplane. And as they do that, a young Air Corps soldier is there handing him out these half sheets of yellow mimeographed paper. And so Richard takes his and moves down the aisle, and he plops down and he rests his hands on his equipment and he says, oh, Sicily, because nobody tells the privates what they're up to. And then he said, and I looked down the fuselage, and some of the guys were balling it up and throwing it away, but I thought this was important, so I folded it up and I put it in the pocket on my sleeve up here. And 50-some-odd years later, when he showed up to meet me, he had it in a photo album. It was a physical connection between him and his comrades from all those years before. Now, if you take a look at the message itself and what's going on there, first couple paragraphs, big picture stuff, right? This is not hyperbole. The world is watching. These troopers are going to be the first Americans to set foot on what Hitler has called Fortress Europe. The Nazis have been making a big deal out of this. The Americans can't measure up, and they're fat, and they drink too much Coca-Cola, and they watch movies all the time. They can't measure up. Guess what? Richard Knopf gets to test that theory. Gavin acknowledges that this is a big deal in those first couple paragraphs. Then he gets to some very practical advice that he delivers in plain English. Boy, if there were ever two guidelines for how we communicate as leaders, it's practical advice, because it's useful to the audience, delivered in plain English. Conserve your water and ammunition. Use the countersign at night to avoid firing on one another. Countersign is there's a one-word challenge. It was George that night. The correct response is Marshall. Now okay, I hear you, I say George, you say Marshall, we're good. You answer in another language, we got to work some things out, right? So use the countersign at night. And then Gavin has this part in there about the American parachutist. What do you think's going on there, Nat? What's that about? Inspiration. How so? Why is it inspiring? You're embarking on something no one has ever done before, and you're doing it as a team. You belong to something bigger than just yourself. That's the payoff. I belong to something bigger than just myself. The other guy's relying on me. Gavin knows that the reason soldiers fight is so they don't let down the guy next to them. You may join the Army because the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and you may become a paratrooper because you get a spiffy uniform, but when you're in some hole in some godforsaken piece of real estate somewhere in Europe and someone is shooting at you personally, and the sergeant gives you one of these, which means get up and move forward, the only reason you're going to do that is because the guy next to you is counting on you. That's it. Everything else falls away. One of the paratroopers told me I'd take a bullet before I'd let my buddy think me a coward. I mean, that's some serious bonds. Gavin knows that, and he reminds the men of these bonds quite literally at the 11th hour. Now, here's something I discovered about this. This is not a letter that Gavin dashed off in haste, D-2. Jim Gavin had been preparing to write this letter for his entire career. If you go to Fort Bragg in North Carolina, the home of this unit, the 82nd Airborne Division, Gavin's letters are deposited at the museum there. There are notebooks that Gavin kept as a young officer. He was autodidact, constantly studying, learning new things. One of the things he practiced doing was writing battle speeches. He practiced and he did literary analyses of famous battle speeches, including from Shakespeare, Henry V, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. That's where that comes from. It's those connections that are important, and Gavin managed to do that in a couple of paragraphs here. Then he's got these two sentences in there: attack violently, destroy him wherever found, him being the enemy. In a modern combat order, this would be called the commander's intent. The commander's intent is a clear picture of the desired end state. Think how powerful that is. Give me a single declarative sentence or two that tells me, boss, what you want to have happen when all is said and done. Because if the whole plan falls apart, and of course we know it does, I still know what the objective is. I still know what we're supposed to accomplish here. I still know what you want to have happen. That's a powerful tool. And if you think about going through an organization, if everybody has that kind of clarity around what it is we're trying to accomplish, they can then take it upon themselves to figure out a new way to get there, if that's what's called for. So Gavin's sends his men off. They got on these airplanes, and off they go. And they're completely out of his control by this point. And that's the scary thing. He's developed the people. He's created a team where they rely on one another. He's trained them to standards with the help of his junior leaders. And then he puts them on the airplanes, and off they go, and let's see what happens. That's completely decentralized leadership. How did it work out? Well, as I said earlier, one of his commanders is our guest, then Captain Edwin Sayer from Breckenridge, Texas, who is the commander of Company A, about 140 some odd paratroopers. He's the ranking man on the airplane. They're his guys. He's in the door of the aircraft. When it crosses the coast, he recognizes, yeah, this doesn't look familiar. The pilot does another racetrack thing, and they come around. The green light goes on, and out he goes. He can see from under his, suspended from under his chute for a few seconds, a lot of concentrated fire, or fire coming from one place. He lands in some rolling hills, gets tangled up in vineyards. Right? He knows, first of all, well, this is not where we're supposed to be. They were supposed to be dropped on a dirt airstrip, so that's gone wrong already. But they're safe for the moment because they're in this low ground and the machine gun fire cannot reach them. So he acts. He starts calling in his junior leaders. And then he picks a couple guys, and they're going to do a reconnaissance to go pinpoint where all that enemy fire is coming from while his company is gathering. So they go over and they find a two-story stone building. He'll learn later it's the winery. The enemy has turned it into a strong point. Trenches, barbed wire, minefields, machine guns, just it's a fortress. Goes back to where his guys are gathering, calls in his junior leaders and briefs them on the plan. And then, and I've always been fascinated with this, then he gives them time to crawl out there in the dark and brief every last private. Think about this from the point of view of the private. And sometimes when we get in a hurry, we forget that there's a whole bunch of people that need some clarity around what we're doing. You are a 20-year-old, 21-year-old private. You just spent 3 of the most miserable months of your existence in North Africa. One of the paratroopers told me I would have jumped into Berlin to get out of North Africa, okay? That's pretty bad. They shove you on this airplane, you get violently airsick because of those crosswinds, you leap out into the dark, you land, you're behind enemy lines alone at night. You're never alone in the military. There's no such thing as privacy in the military. Now, behind enemy lines at night, now I'm alone. Great. Every sound is terrifying, and then one of those sounds turns into your sergeant coming out of the darkness. And a lot of the guys hugged the first GI they saw. And the sergeant says, look, kid, here's the deal. Yeah, nobody knows where we are. Forget about that. But Captain Sayer's got a plan. Here's your part in the plan. Think about the power that gives this organization. This is the plan. Here's my part in the plan. This is not something that happened instantaneously in the dark in Sicily. This is something they'd been planning for all along. Because when the sergeant says assault on a fortified position, I immediately get the picture in my head of what that looks like, and I know exactly where I have to go and exactly how it's going to go through time. Because I've done it 300 times since I put my first uniform on. At dawn, A Company assaults this enemy position. They capture a mixed bag of German and Italian prisoners. They're in pretty good shape. A couple hours later, Colonel Sayer's boss comes down the road, a fellow named Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Gorham, his battalion commander. And Colonel Gorham says, they get their maps out, they figure out where they think they are, and he says, well, good job, Captain, but let's not forget the objective, the regimental objective. Now, the main objective is this road junction right here. Very cleverly called, I think, the Y road junction. You see that? You're with me? Are you following? Y road junction. Why is it important? The enemy has armored vehicles in the Semi. One of the invasion beaches is at Gela. To get from the Semi to Gela, you must go through this intersection. It's very hilly in this part of Sicily. It's the only way you can get there. The enemy has fortified this position. It is critical for the paratroopers to take it and control it to block those counterattacks on the morning of D-Day. It is so important that Gavin has assigned it as a mission to 2,200 of his 3,400 men. That'll tell you how important he thought it was. But of course, there are no 2,200 guys around. There's Captain Sayer, who's managed to collect 80 men. And as far as I know, when Colonel Gorham says, let's not forget what the mission is, Captain Sayer does not say, sir, did you hit your head real hard when you landed? Or could we wait around, see if anybody else shows up? you know, maybe collect some more data, do some more analysis. He says, airborne, sir, and off they go. No idea of how he's going to accomplish this mission. He winds up in the saddle between these low hills right here. It's about 1,000 yards away from the intersection. My daughter and I stood there when I was researching this book. Looks through his binoculars, sees exactly what he expects to see, which is that the enemy has fortified this. Minefields, wire, trenches, and there are these concrete emplacements called pillboxes with machine guns inside. It's a fortress. No way 80 guys are going to take this in a frontal assault. Yet that is his mission, is to take it. So he watches for a while. And as he's watching, the U.S. Navy is trying to shell that position because they got those big guns. But they're missing. All the rounds are going long. And they don't know that they're missing because there's a big hill between the sea and the target. And of course, if you don't know you're missing, why would you adjust your fire? And Captain Sayre cannot talk to the Navy because the radios are not compatible. There's some good planning for you. So as he watches, he thinks, well, you know what? I'll bet those guys down there, they don't know I can't talk to the Navy. So he turns to a young Italian-American soldier he's got working as an interpreter, Vincent Calandrino from New York City, whose parents are from Sicily. And he says, Calandrino, get one of them Italian prisoners, send them on down there, tell them fellas they got 10 minutes to give up, or I'm going to adjust that fire, blow them all to smithereens, which he cannot do. It's not even clear to me whether or not Calandrino knew that this was a bluff. I couldn't find Vincent in New York City. But in a 1947 report that Colonel Sayre wrote about this, he said, well, evidently the prisoner was an eloquent speaker. Because in less than 10 minutes, the entire garrison surrendered to him without his firing a shot. He accomplished the regimental, he and Vincent Calandrino accomplished the regimental mission through a ruse. Now, I tell this story, and I tell this story everywhere, not just because Colonel Sayre is here, for a couple reasons. I am unabashedly, this guy's a hero of mine. He just did a lot of cool stuff. Very, Now, it wasn't, I wasn't expecting that reaction. But the other cool thing is, then Captain Sayre is the ultimate experiment in leader development. Captain Sayre was a sergeant in the Texas National Guard. When he came into federal service, the U.S. Army was so desperate for officers, they gave out written tests. Do a good job, we'll make you a lieutenant. And then we promise we'll send you to all the schools that you need, which of course never happens, right? Paperwork gets lost. So on paper, Captain Sayre is not even really on paper, not even qualified to be a lieutenant, much less a captain in charge of 140 men. But continuously, starting in the Guard and through this service with the paratroopers, there was always somebody looking who said, you know what, that boy's got some talent, let's put him in charge of something, let's see what he can do. It is my contention that that kind of talent exists in every organization. One of my key responsibilities as a leader is to identify it, give people a chance to step up, put them in situations where they can step up, and it paid off for Colonel Gavin on D-Day. Now, Colonel Gavin, we left him with 5 guys, stranded on the morning of D-Day, pinned down all day on D-Day in a ditch, trying not to get captured by patrols, German patrols that are out there, supremely frustrated, can't do anything, doesn't even know where he is. When the sun goes down on D-Day, most important day of his career, certainly, he's up and moving to the northwest, because that's where the wind had been coming from. On Sunday morning, D+1, July 11th, he arrives south of the town of Victoria, runs into a group of about 350 paratroopers commanded by a guy named Major Ed Krause, one of his subordinates. The two officers get their maps out. They figure out, oh, okay, I think this is where we are. Gavin says, good, get your guys ready to move as quickly as possible. I'm going to take these 30. We're leaving right now. I got to get to that Y road junction, see what's going on there. Mid-morning, they arrive in the vicinity of Piazza Ridge, on the southeast side of Piazza Ridge, which is not this huge. It rises probably only 150 feet over maybe 3/4 mile or so. It's mostly olive groves and dust and sunburned grass. But as Gavin arrives, a paratrooper comes running off. Now remember, the countryside is full of paratroopers wandering around looking for other GIs. A paratrooper comes running off. He says, hey, sir, the Germans are up there. They're snooping around, and they have tanks. This is not good news. So Gavin looks at his map, and he realizes what's going on. This ridge line and the river behind it, the Acate River, are the only significant terrain features between the two invasion beaches. If the Germans can split the American force, they have to fight only half at a time. A big advantage. Gavin, this is not his job. This is not his mission, and they are not equipped to fight tanks, but he thinks about his commander's intent. Why did we come to Sicily? To make the invasion succeed. He sends a runner back, hustle up those 350 guys. He and his 30 men crawl up the backside of Biazza Ridge and go into action against Germans with tanks. This is a picture taken by a U.S. Army Signal Corps photographer of some of Gavin's men going into action up Biazza Ridge. I think this actually shows a lot of cleverness on the part of the photographer who is on the friendly side of the ridge in the low ground. So that's smart. There ensues this all-day tug of war over the top of this bridge. Now, I said that this valley behind him is full of paratroopers wandering around, right? Onesies and twosies. One of those guys is a 26-year-old from Charlotte, North Carolina, named Harold Eatman, pictured here on the right. Harold is a corporal. He's managed to collect 6 other lost souls. They hear the shooting. What do when they hear gunfire? Where do they go? They go towards it. Yes. Why? Because that's the culture of the organization. Harold said, that's what was expected of me. Why question that? It was that deeply ingrained. There's some GIs up there in a fight. Let's go help out. Up the backside of Biazza Ridge, they completely miss Gavin, down to the enemy side. They get taken under fire. They scatter. Now it's Harold and one other guy. They're panting. Let's go back up the slope. Harold's been out of water for hours now. They're desperate to see some Americans. They get to a cactus fence, which the Sicilians use to delineate their cattle fields. You got to cross over, okay? So the first guy goes, Harold follows. Harold steps out through the fence, and 25 yards down the lane is a German armored vehicle. Alerted because of the first trooper running across, they fire on Harold. He's not hit, but he just falls into the cactus. He said, I didn't know what to do, so I just played dead. He has no idea why nobody checked, but they didn't. But now Harold's alone on the battlefield, desperate to find another American. He's running up the slope. He spies what he thinks is the silhouette of an American helmet underneath the olive trees up there. Forget challenge and password. Don't shoot, don't shoot. I'm an American. He runs up. It's a guy in a shallow foxhole. He slides in next to the guy like it's home plate, and he looks up. It's Colonel Gavin in the foxhole. Now, in any other organization, you might think, well, you know what? If the colonel's up here with a rifle, maybe things aren't going that well for us. You know, something's wrong with this plan. Never occurred to Harold that Gavin would be anywhere else. And indeed, throughout the remainder of the day, Gavin is up front. The Germans drop mortar fire on the ridge, trying to dislodge the paratroopers. Gavin is slightly wounded. At one point, one of his officers says, "Sir, we could pull back 100 yards. There's a concrete culvert back there. You could run things back there. And by the way, please don't get killed, because then we're really in a hurt." Gavin says, "No, I don't think you know what's at stake here. I need to be up front. I need to be visible. Plugging the line, moving the wounded off." Mid-afternoon, a young Navy ensign by the name of G.A. Holton arrives on the field with the most powerful weapon on the modern battlefield, a radio, with which he can talk to the Navy. He calls fire down on the Germans' positions, and they vacate the area. And when the sun goes down on D+1, Gavin and his troopers are on the top of Biazza Ridge. Now, this is not an action, not a battle that Gavin won just on July 11th. He had been preparing for this action for more than a year, when he brought the right people onto the team, when he envisioned what kind of unit he needed to succeed in that chaos. When he set the standards, when he enlisted the help of people like Ed Sayer, Tim Dias, to train those people to standard, and demanded of them that they do more than they thought they were capable of. When he shared their hardships, when he set very clear expectations, and he led from the front, even at the risk of his life. That's how he pulled that off. Now, you might think I'd known something about General Gavin, given our backgrounds. We both went to the same school. He was pretty famous. I wasn't. He was. I really didn't know much about General Gavin. And then in 1998, I was up at West Point researching a book on how the military academy develops leaders. I'd been out all day with the new cadets, basic trainings in the summer, running around the hills. So they all go back to the barracks, clean their weapons. I go to the bar at the hotel. What can I say? You know, it was good enough for Hemingway. It's good enough for me. So I'm in the lounge. I'm the only person in there. It's only like 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I've got my notes out. And this guy walks into the bar. Even if I hadn't been at West Point, I'd have probably picked him out as a soldier. He's 80 years old. He's got this erect carriage, walks right up to me. "Hi, Jack Norton. Good to meet you." I said, "Sir, why don't you have a seat? Let me buy you a drink." He sits down. He's wearing a name tag. It says Jack Norton, 41, West Point class in 1941. Clearly, he's a World War II veteran. After 2 Manhattans, he's like telling some stories, man. And the guy is a storyteller. And he tells me about the paratroopers. Jack Norton signed on with this outfit in the summer of 1942 and served all the way through VE Day at the end of the war. So he made the combat jump into Sicily in July of 43, the combat jump into Italy in September of 43, the combat jump into France on D-Day, June 6, 1944, combat jump into Holland in September of 44, the Battle of the Bulge starting December 16, 1944, finishing up in January, campaign across Germany. This unit, the 82nd Airborne Division, was invited to Berlin to be the American Honor Guard. Berlin captured by the Soviets. These guys represented the United States in Berlin. And then as a chaser after the war, in January 46, Jack Norton organized the Army's portion of the Victory Parade in New York City. So this is a guy, he'd been a couple places, you know, he'd done a couple things. So I'm like completely fascinated. I'm asking him questions, and I said, well, how do you build an organization that succeeds when everything goes wrong? He said, well, it takes good training, and he talked about this notion of empowering junior leaders and being keen to develop those people because they're going to have to step up. He said it takes good soldiers. His affection for these men, still visible almost 60 years later. He says, and it takes good leaders. And he wasn't talking about himself. He was talking about the other leaders, and in particular Jim Gavin. And I said, well, sir, what kind of leader was Jim Gavin? And for the first time all afternoon, he paused, and he looked me dead in the eye, and he said, he set us on fire. Boy, if I could have one person say that about me in my lifetime, I'd think, man, I really did something here, you know. That kind of leadership that Gavin showed is not a function of, you know, genetics or looks or charisma. It's something you can get better at. Is everybody going to be Jim Gavin? No. And not everybody's going to be tested the way Jim Gavin was. I believe that most people, that big chunk of the bell curve, can get better at it. But you have to approach it deliberately. You have to think of leadership as a discipline that you can study. It takes courage to try new things and to admit that you don't know everything already. It takes imagination to come up with, yeah, there are no resources for training, and yet we still have to develop people. That takes a lot of imagination. And finally, it takes compassion. If I really care about what motivates you, I have to care about you. We're not going to be buddies. You're not coming to my house for dinner, but I have to recognize that you have in you some notion of what success looks like, and the more that I can feed that and align that with the organization's notion of success, the better off that we're going to be. It's not easy, but it is doable for most people.